for not only this conversation, but where we are in our nation. This is truly a historic time, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about that and from the perspective of communities of color. Today, we have two amazing, phenomenal, wonderful guests with us. So I want to take a moment to introduce them, and we'll start with Marlene Mendoza. She is an independent policy consultant and has worked with various DC nonprofit policy and advocacy organizations. She provides research, support, and analysis on various issues related to youth of color, youth in poverty, young adult mental health, and disconnected youth. Prior to being a consultant and research assistant with the Center for Law and Social Policy, CLASP, Marlene received her BA in International Studies and Global Health at the University of Iowa. As an undergrad, she was a project coordinator for Despierta a tu Salud, Wake Up to Your Health, at the University of Iowa College of Public Health, where she worked to increase HPV vaccination rates among Latino youth in West Liberty, Iowa. She trained and led a group of undergraduate research assistants to conduct health education workshops and piloted intercept surveys on HPV awareness and vaccination. Additionally, she served as a local policy advocate for the community ID for Johnson County, where she raised awareness about the benefits municipal IDs could provide vulnerable populations who lack a primary form of identification. Marlene currently lives in North Liberty, Iowa, and is the president of her local LULAC, which is the League of United Latin American Citizens, chapter in Iowa City, and is the chair of LULAC, Iowa State Civic Engagement Committee. So please join me in welcoming Marlene.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here today.
In addition, we also have Audra Wilson joining us, who is currently serving as the president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. Audra Wilson has been a champion for racial and economic justice for more than 20 years as a public interest lawyer and teacher, policy shaper, community mobilizer, and experienced executive manager. Throughout her career, Wilson has focused on the voices and experiences of communities of color and communities most impacted by injustice. Wilson began her legal career as a welfare advocate staff attorney with the Shriver Center on Poverty Law, so full circle, which I love, where she focused on welfare reform implementation and food security issues in Illinois. She was then tapped by then Senator, yes, Barack Obama, to serve as the deputy press and policy director on his US Senate campaign. After the US Senate race, Wilson returned to her public interest roots, serving as director of diversity, education, and outreach and adjunct professor at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law for 7 years. At Northwestern, she co-founded the first formal consortium of law school diversity professionals in Chicago, seen as a national model. During this time, Wilson also served as a policy advisor to leading candidates for US Senate, Illinois State Treasurer, and Lieutenant Governor. In 2013, Wilson accepted a position as Deputy Chief of Staff for United States Congresswoman Robin Kelly in the 2nd Congressional District of Illinois, where she oversaw all district operations and served as a surrogate for the Congresswoman while she was serving in DC. Among Wilson's other responsibilities, she served as lead Illinois coordinator of the Congressional Caucus on Black Women and Girls. As executive director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois, Wilson led critical change to expand the mission of a 100-year-old, not quite that old, of a 100-year-old civic engagement organization with nearly 4,000 members and over 40 chapters statewide. Wilson advanced the League's advocacy on issues of race equity and voting rights and built organizational capacity for fundraising and communications. In October 2019, Wilson was appointed chair of the Cook County Commission on Women's Issues by Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Wilson holds a bachelor's degree in international relations and Spanish from Bucknell University and a JD from Valparaiso University School of Law. Please join me in welcoming Audra Wilson. So now that we have the formal introductions out of the way, I'm about to get super informal because I really want this to be a conversation. I want it to feel as if we're all just having a conversation around our kitchen tables, because that is the way to get people excited and engaged about democracy, is to make it not up there, but right here in our daily lives. So please know that I intend to be relaxed. I intend to use colloquialisms. I'm going to say y'all a lot, and all of that's okay. And I want you to feel comfortable to engage with us, utilize the chat if you have comments or questions, and also just get loose and get comfortable. We're about to have a lot of fun. So I'm going to hop right in. into our conversation, I want to start with you, Audra, in terms of asking you to speak a little bit about the truth that a lot of people are saying right now in terms of people who are in communities of color don't vote. Can you speak to that myth a little bit and give us maybe even some historic reasons why that myth may exist?
Well, you just really just jumped right in there, didn't you?
And you know what? Just to our viewers, I'm already off script, so I apologize to our.
That was question number 4, and you already got down there, so okay.
I'm hopping right in.
So, well, hi everyone, and it's nice to be back. I had a chance to be with Roosevelt students just earlier this year, so, and now to come back again. So, folks of color not voting. Well, that's not true. So, and there is lots of empirical data, anecdotal data, every sort of data out there to dispel that. As a matter of fact, not only is it not true, we know for a fact that it is because of the vote of particular communities of color that have certain people have actually been able to make it into office and to remain in office. So we can just knock that out from the very beginning. But what I think you're alluding more to, though, is a growing frustration among different groups, particularly voters of color, about, you know, does my vote matter, and is it going to change the outcome of anything? And that frustration it's not unique to communities of color, but it is certainly very prevalent. And you also sometimes see the lack of voting in terms of like a large block with specific age groups and demographics, and obviously we'll get more into that. But historically, voting, and I'll speak specifically for the Black community, this has been a long, hard fight. So prior to starting at the Schreiber Center, and I started actually in June of this year, I was the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Illinois. And the conversation that I had in my previous role was really talking about the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted the right of women to vote, but how it took another 45 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment to pass the Voting Rights Amendment, which finally removed all sorts of legal and constructive impediments to voting for people of color, and in particular Black people. So from poll taxes to literacy tests and any other scheme to keep people from being able to access the polls, that was the significance of the Voting Rights Act. But what we're seeing contemporarily is that the protections that were afforded by the Voting Rights Act are being eroded slowly but surely, and was really eroded by a fairly recent Supreme Court decision that essentially removed the protection for states who want to change their voting schemes that we know will have a disproportionate impact on particular communities. Once upon a time, after the passage of the act, states basically couldn't just suddenly decide to change something that would have an impact on a particular community because that was thought of being very suspicious, and it was, because it was intended to disenfranchise. But with now loosening the restrictions and sort of taking out the teeth of the Voting Rights Act, a lot of communities of color are very, very concerned about basically losing constructively that right to vote or having it impeded in some way, shape, or form. But I would say to anyone who is listening and viewing that the right to vote is not only just a hallowed right, it is one for which people have fought and died, quite frankly, to have. And so, you know, I think that generally speaking, and I'll speak again for Black communities, there is an understanding of that. And people do very much take that into consideration. But you're also starting to see a generational divide where we have a younger generations, and I'm somewhere in the middle, I'm a Gen Xer, but younger generations are very much into activism, which is wonderful, but sometimes get very frustrated when they're not seeing immediate results. And sometimes feel like that activism means that, you know, if I don't like any of the choices, then, you know, I shouldn't be just sort of casting my ballot, just, you know, if I'm not really supporting anybody, and they want to channel their votes, or they channel their energies in other places. Whereas older generations do, understand that, sometimes it is about, you're not casting your ballot necessarily for the next person, but it is about stabilization. It's broader than just the people who are on the ballot. It's about what are the other things that are at stake. And they are also coming from a time when they remember that it was difficult for them to be able to vote. So you do see some generational differences in terms of who is more or less likely to vote. But overall, I would just disavow people of that notion that Black folks don't vote, because we do.
I want to pick up on something that you said, Audra, and I'm going to toss it to Marlene. In your commentary, you talked about how people are feeling or have felt that their personal vote didn't matter, that my one vote doesn't really make a difference. And when we think about 2016, many of those individuals who are part of communities of color, that may have been their first time voting. And so in 2016, you have folks who, not as many people in previous elections, but we still had, we had turnout, and those people, many of those people felt after walking away that, maybe my vote didn't matter in the end, or maybe I wish I had voted, but it seemed like so many schemes were going on to try to disenfranchise my vote anyway. So what difference does it make in 2020 if I show up or not, given what I feel has been done over the course of the past 4 years to continue to disenfranchise the vote? So Marlene, how do you respond to those individuals who maybe voted in 2016 and are parts of communities of color and are in some ways thinking, I don't even know if the system works?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, I kind of want to touch first on what Audra mentioned in regards to the differences intergenerationally and how, for example, youth and young adults come out, or what it motivates them to turn out and vote versus the more established, older folks who have been doing this and practicing their civic duty for a much longer time. They know how the game has been played for longer than you would say youth or young adults, right? However, based on my experience in my work, I meet with youth and young adults. That's part of my work as a youth policy, advocacy and policy and all the things that I do. And in many of the conversations that I've had with youth and young adults, it's one very simple thing. And it really comes down to how this nation has turned its back on our generation and the generation that follows after us, Gen Z. We will be the first generation that will be worse off than their parents. And we understand that our civic duty is to vote. However, at the same time, we also have to understand the frustration that comes with the pushback that a lot of these youth and young adults are asking for, right? At a personal level, I'm a first generation American. My parents are immigrants, they come from Mexico. So to me and my peers who are first generation Americans, to us, it's such an honor to be a part of this country, to be an American and say, hey, I want to participate in the civic duty. At the same time, when I look at my other peers who, have been in this country for much longer, who understand the different types of institutional betrayal that they have faced, and that they're fed up with the incremental change that we're constantly fed. We're way overdue on this incremental change because we haven't seen it. Where is it? Where both parties are complicit in that they say that if you pick either side, that everything's going to be okay and things are going to change. But yet when they get voted in, nothing happens, right? And you can see this in the frustration of youth and young adults when they were promised changes in the environment, when they were promised changes in the criminal justice system, when they were promised, for example, the dreamers. They were promised that something was going to change and they were going to be able to become or have a path to citizenship. And all of these promises have now, under this administration, been so close to being completely pulled back from the small incremental changes that did not come from our politicians. It came from people on the ground who said, hey, we voted you in. You promised you were going to change something. Now we're fed up and we're actually going to take it to the streets because you have to do something about this. So I feel like it's a lot of things that are built up on top of the frustration. Back in 2008, many of us who are millennials now, we understood what happened to our parents and our peers when the financial crisis hit. People lost their homes. A lot of people did not recover from that. The stock markets might have recovered, but normal people, the majority of the working class people, did not. And we still have not made up that loss. And now we have the pandemic, we have an economic crisis, we have all these other things that are happening. Businesses are being lost. Many of these businesses who are being hurt the most are businesses from Little Village, where my family lives, in Chicago, from different small Black owned businesses in Chicago as well. They cannot afford to be put off for all these months with no help and then told that they're supposed to recover, right? So I know I'm mentioning a lot of these issues, but all of these issues are connected when young people see, how am I supposed to believe that if I do something like this, that the future will change, right? And I think where I can go with this is that when I have these conversations with youth and young adults, when I mention to them the importance of policy and how, yes, and national elections, presidential elections are very important, but I also let them know that they don't have to wait every 4 years to feel this kind of frustration to vote, because you have to pay attention to your local elections. This is one thing that I tell a lot of my folks back in Chicago. Like, I'm not in Chicago, I'm in Iowa City now, but when I do connect with my folks back in Chicago, I let them know, do you know who your alderman is? Do you know how much power your alderman has? Do you know that they are the ones that decide what contractors are coming into your community to either build up properties, have connections with contractors, to bring in economic opportunity? Do you know that you are being sold out on that, in that sense, in your own community, right? So I think what youth and young adults are starting to realize is that they have to understand the power levels. Who is in charge in certain positions in my local community? How do I respond to them? How do I show up to the city councils? How do I say, hey, this is not what we want. Let's look at the policy. And I think we're starting to see that. And I think that if we have the conversation about more local elections, about the policy, about the things that we can bring to the table at the local level and then bring it up, because youth and young adults have always been at the forefront of change through grassroots movements. We've always been like, this is not just the youth now, like youth back in the 60s and even before that, they were the ones leading that change. For example, like, I know that when we're young, we look at textbooks and we see black and white pictures, but we don't remember that the Greenboro sit-ins, those were young adults. They were in the early 20s. When you look at MLK, he was a young adult. These were all young people who knew the sacrifice, knew how hard it was for them to step up and create that change within our communities, to say, as a young person, you can ask for the future that you want. And we can do it, but we have to do it together, right? And I think that, I'll give you a quick example. So if we go back to 2016, when we saw a lot of this youth activism pop up, we saw a lot of policy recommendations for the first time being brought in, not only through Bernie Sanders, you had Elizabeth Warren, you had a plethora of a lot of more, I guess you can call them progressive, but just new phase of politicians, you know, members of the squad included, who started to talk about a different way of American politics. They started to say, we don't have to keep doing things the same way. We can ask for more. And it's kind of sad that in our country, as youth and young adults, we realize, wait, we can ask for more. We can actually do this. And I think that's what encouraged a lot of people to say, they're right. If folks, if our brothers, our sisters in the past, uncles, aunties, whoever they are, if they weren't able to do this, they at least gave us a foundation to know that we can go and vote, and that we have certain things in place that can protect our vote, and certain things that they cannot violate for us. But we can now take that and build on it and say, hey, you cannot keep trying to play the same, it's the same coin, it's two different sides of the same coin. Now we want to know about the policy. It's not enough for you to look like one of us, because we understand that just because you look like us does not mean that you might have the best interest in mind. We're beyond that game. We can see beyond the veil. We want to know, what are you going to do to help us out? What are your recommendations for workers' rights? What are you going to do for people of color in this country, et cetera, et cetera. And back then in 2016, a lot of these things, everyone, mainstream media was freaking out. They were saying, oh, these kids, they're like, you know, this is like unicorns and rainbows. This is pie in the sky. What do you mean education, free education, canceling student, all of these things that at the time seemed absurd. Fast forward to 2020, look at the policies that Joe Biden campaign and Kamala Harris. Listen, they were my favorite candidates, right? We don't have to go into that right now, but they are being pushed and they are being trying to held accountable, saying, okay, these are the things that you're saying. If you get in, what is your plan to move forward? And I think that we are going to continue to hold them accountable, regardless of how the election plays out. I think young people are starting to realize that we have to start looking for the details and saying that it's not enough to virtual signal. It's not enough for you to say that you don't believe the kids should be in cages, or putting out another press statement about Black Lives Matters for company credit, or so that you don't lose your stock, or whatever the heck it is, right? We're very much awakening in this country and realizing that there has to be huge reform and change in the way that we approach our politics, because at a certain point, you know, people can only take so much, you know, and that is a majority of us. And we have to know that in order for us to make this change, we have to vote at our national elections down the ballot. We choose the deputies, we choose attorneys of generals, we choose so many different representatives in our communities. And we have to carry that on beyond what happens in the election into our local elections and just start from the ground up. And I feel that when we approach young people through that perspective of saying, hey, what's the issue that you most see in your community that bothers you? how can we work around to identify the resources that exist in your community, and how we can connect you to some people in those areas that then can then help you advocate and connect the advocacy issue that you're doing on the streets to the actual policy, right? We have to teach youth and young adults those resources so that they can recommend and draft their own policies and say, hey, we show up to city council, this is what we want, how are we going to get it done? They can't turn you then, they work for you. They literally are there to represent you. So I know that was a very long-winded response, but it's really kind of the strategy that I've done to try to help with youth and young adults to get them motivated so that they can then say, I have to participate. You know, I have to participate in this election, in this process, in my civic duty.
Wow, you just took us on a journey. And I literally was like, yes, in my mind. To every 10 seconds, I'm like, yes, yes, yes. And you made me think of a really important point. I don't know that we can discuss this election without discussing the events of the summer. We saw millions of people pour into the streets, and this wasn't a movement that was particular or specific to one community, although it was a Black Lives Matter movement in some ways. But really, this was a global movement. It was the largest social movement in the history of humankind that's been recorded and that we know of. And when we think about that, the millions of people pouring into the streets, the millions of Black Americans, and the millions of Latinx Americans and LGBTQIA Americans, all different walks of life, getting together, feeling the collective power of what it means to go up against a system, and beginning to see what I would say is the beginnings of real change as it relates to police reform in this country. And my question is really around the dichotomy that exists between the immediacy of getting into the streets and sometimes the slow burn of voting and the slow burn of policy work, and how that can feel less impactful to folks who are going in and voting and not seeing that immediate response, right? There's something to be said of, 10,000 people getting out on the streets and then the governor changing their position based on that, versus the 2 or 3 year time that it may take to push a bill or a policy through Congress. And I raise that because I want you both, if you can, to speak to that and to speak to the connection that really does exist between activism and voting, because I don't know that people think that there is a connection, because there is a lack in terms of sometimes seeing that response. So can you speak to how voting actually plays, or if you think this, if it plays a role in social activism, and if so, in what way?
So, well, first of all, with Marlene, I agreed with everything that she said, and I was nodding enthusiastically too. And I really appreciated talking about the importance of staying engaged, because everyone looks at the high profile race and aren't thinking about the immediacy of the of local elections, and people are making decisions that impact your daily lives, much more so in many ways than things that are higher up on the ticket. So I thank you for pointing that out. I definitely think that there is a connection between activism and voting, but I think it's changed considerably over the last several decades. What Marlene was talking a lot about was, and you too, Jamar, was the incrementalism. And you have to understand incrementalism, because we're looking at things contemporarily, where we have social media, where generations are now almost micro generations. I have colleagues and friends of mine who were only 10 years apart, and yet I feel like we may as well be 30 years apart sometimes in the way that we look at things, simply because of how quickly, with the advent of social media and how we've created these micro generations and how perspectives have changed so quickly. But the reason why that's significant is that at the time that you saw a lot of that youth agitation, and Marlene was correct, I mean, it was where SNCC and others, I mean, these were very young people. So all the old folks that you see out there from the civil rights movement were the same age, and they were they were active and engaging people at that young age. But that was at a time where the systems were very different. There were many more barriers and impediments. So things did move a lot slower in almost at a glacial pace. So sometimes when you're having conversations with people in different generations, the reason why they look at things differently is because at that time, incremental changes were monumental changes because there was no expectation that they could go out and agitate and it'll be fixed tomorrow. When you're looking at the bus boycott, for example, that was a long, when people think of Rosa Parks and just misunderstanding that this was not a woman sitting down because she's tired. This was part of a strategy. And there were many that were involved in this strategy. And it was a strategy that was over several years and planning of this, and creating alternate systems to get people to work. See, when you decontextualize that history, then it's easy for people to think, oh, well, so-and-so did this and then bam, this happened. And that's just not the case. So it's really important to put things back into proper context in history. But even when it is in history, you have to look at the fact that there was no social media. There was no instant access to people. It was not easy just to be able to just light the fire and say, meet here at this time and we're going to agitate on this issue. These are things that had to be really thought of and planned out and be much more deliberate than they are today. So I can understand why people who are younger sometimes feel that frustration, why they don't see immediate results. Because as quickly as they were able to mobilize and assemble behind something, naturally you'd want to think that there's going to be some, immediate response. But the system hasn't caught up quite as yet. And so it does still move at that glacial pace. Now, does that mean that we can't light a fire under the system and get things moving faster? No, I'm not saying that at all. As a matter of fact, I think there are many ways that we can sort of light a fire under people. But it is important for people to understand that we're using much more modern techniques of activism and engagement in a system that is still decades and decades behind. So you won't always see the immediacy, or the immediate results of your actions. But I do think it is something to really to think about. How do we engage and how do we activate and get people moving? Sometimes, there are lawmakers and others that are more proactive and more responsive. But oftentimes you're talking about, especially if you're agitating and in a community where you have a lawmaker, let's say a federal lawmaker who may not have a lot of support, maybe that sort of that lone wolf because the party, that is not necessarily behind that person. So sometimes they're making decisions and they're thinking like, well, I'm trying to stay in office. And so it's hard to engage them and get them to do something because they're not feeling like, well, what's the incentive for me to do this? So that's why my approach tends to be multifaceted in terms of agitation and mobilization. Absolutely, you should be pushing lawmakers as hard as you possibly can. And Marlene was correct when you say you voted them in, and you should absolutely hold them accountable, irrespective of what your political party is or your ideology is. You should hold the people accountable that are in office, and whether or not you voted for them, they're there to represent you. But my only caveat to that is that it can't just be pushing them. There has to be others. You have to be making your voices louder. You have to be, making this a public issue, as big an issue as you possibly can, because sometimes direct engagement of them is not going to help. Sometimes it might be embarrassment. It might be, making them feel like I have no choice. You may have to do that. But there's multiple ways that we need to be thinking about agitating, not just trying to start with our local or politicians or whomever's representing us, but multiple forms of that agitation and activism to move the needle, I think, contemporarily. So I know Marlene must have some more thoughts about that too.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I know we have a lot to go through, so I just want to briefly add a little bit to what Audra said, and I agree with her. I think that where we can connect activism to our voting and what we expect of our politicians or people that are in office is, we have a lot of the call out culture in our social media and in more in our culture, especially in youth culture. But I'm very surprised that really hasn't poured over into some of our politicians on both sides of the party in regards to who are they in bed with. And what I mean by that is let's just have a real conversation. Both parties are in bed with corporations. There is no antitrust laws. We understand that the Washington, D.C. is a revolving door. And we understand why a lot of people feel like it doesn't matter if they vote because they feel that either way, they're not going to be speaking for the people that they're supposed to be working with. And to a certain extent, I see there is a huge truth in that. If you notice in the last 5 to 6 years, there's been a huge push for people to support people who don't have PAC money, super PAC money. And that is something that people are starting to realize. Well, who do you get your money from? Who funds your campaign? Is it from the common person? What is your average donation? Who is the common person that tends to donate to your donation? Are you beholden to Wall Street? And all of these questions are super important. I think we saw the huge spike in it back around 2008 in the crisis. I'm forgetting the name of it, but when they showed up on Wall Street and people were sitting out. I'm forgetting
Occupy.
the name. Yes, Occupy. Yes, when it was Occupy Wall Street, we started to really see it. It literally like just bursted out of people saying like, hey, where is our money? This is our money. This is our tax money. How is it? And and we're seeing the same frustration now with, let's look at the simple fact of the HEROES Act, right? We're in a pandemic. They told you to stay at home. They told you that you had to do all these things. Many people, for their own safety of their families, for very human things, listened to them and said, okay, you know what? It's going to be hard, but I'm going to do what I'm supposed to do. What did the government's response was? They did not do anything. They gave you $1,200, and that's even if you qualified for that. How long have we been into the pandemic? We're about to close down again. I think I just believe that Chicago just closed down completely again, right? Again, that decision goes back to hurting businesses. It goes back to hurting our own communities who maybe their wealth or their little egg was that business. Regardless of what it looked like, whether you were a street vendor, whether you actually had a real business, or whether you were selling things from home, right? What I'm trying to say here is that people need to follow the money. And I think a lot of this activism has to do with economic justice. And that will automatically help a lot of Black and Brown communities, because in fairness, we have to look at how far our dollar goes in the community. We're not in a lot of these positions of power. We're not in a lot of these positions where we can say, we can put money into communities and it can come back to us. We're giving that money to very few corporations who then take that money and then get bailouts. We didn't get bailed out. And yet we have less and less opportunities to put that money in to help out our own community, especially with everything that's happening now. So I think that, to keep it short, I think that if our activism can really call out and say, you know what, there's a lot of differences and inequalities that are happening between communities. We're going to stand together and say, I'm going to support you, because at the end of the day, it's going to help uplift us. But at the same time, we have to turn our backs and look at the 1% and say, you're also trying to divide us by race. And we're not dumb. We know that. And at the end of the day, economic justice is what's hurting the majority of us, regardless of what color you look like. At the end of the day, they're treating you down and telling you things like, we feed you, be quiet, why are you still being loud? And then having them turn around and try to divide us in different tactics, in different political schemes, and different propaganda that you see all the time. And I think we're starting to overcome and realize that it's the same thing being told over and over again. And in honesty, we're just fed up with it. And I think you're starting to see it with a lot of the intersectional identities that we're starting to see in our leaders, in our communities, and the fact that we're bonding together in a lot of these issues, and saying we have to go to the polls, we have to go ahead and ask for more.
So as you talk about the necessity of us getting to the polls, I'm constantly reminded of how much certain parties don't want us to be at the polls. For as much as we can sit here and say that we all need to be there, people who are working very hard to not have us be at polls, and if we are at the polls, to not have our votes counted. And I think there are some very clear representations of this as I think about what happened over the weekend with the Biden bus being essentially assaulted on the road by a group of supporters of the current occupant. I think about that not as the insane moment that it was, but as a tactic of voter suppression. Because if I can demonstrate how scary we can be, well, then I can place a thought in your mind about, well, what might election day look like? Will they be there? Will I be safe, right? And so as I think about that, and in some ways I want to shift quickly, I want to pull in some students that we have here from the Black Student Union and from ALAS, which is the Association of Latin American Students here at Roosevelt. And I'm just curious to hear from you all in terms of, are you feeling that? Are you feeling safe as a person of color going to vote? Are you feeling in a space of relative ease in terms of knowing that when you go to the poll, that you're going to be able to safely cast your ballot? I didn't call anyone specifically, so any of the three of you can go. So Sariah or Adelaide, Michaela, any of you can go.
Hi, everyone. I'm the incoming president of ALAS. And in my community, it's an overall, like where I live, the community is mostly like Black and Hispanic people. So I feel personally comfortable going and voting because I feel comfortable already within my community. Especially like I've been to some of the city meetings with my mom sometimes, and people do try to like take a stance for something that benefits us as a community. So personally, I do feel safe, but I do see the worries of other people, especially like that I have family in Chicago where they live in different communities that they don't feel the same way as I do. I could understand the worries.
And I apologize, I forgot to call out the Muslim Student Association is also here. Poonam, feel free to hop in on this question as well.
I'm voting in Chicago, like downtown Chicago, so I felt pretty safe voting because Chicago, it's very liberal and it's very diverse. But I do understand the worries of people of color when they are voting, especially in those places where like there's like the Trump poll watchers and like people are signing up to watch the polls, which is essentially just intimidation at the end of the day. But I do understand the worry. It's very unfortunate that we live in an era now where people don't feel safe to like vote, which was like once like in the past, and we thought it was going to stay in the past, but obviously it's not.
So with that, and I'm so glad that you all brought that up. I want to share a couple of quick numbers on this question of what happens when we don't vote. So if we look at 2016 in that race, the Black vote declined for the first time in 20 years. So in 2012, 66.6% of the African American population voted, whereas in 2016, only 59.6% voted. The Latino population remained relatively flat between 2012 and 2016 at 47.6 and 48% in both of those races. But then when I look at specifically the white population, so if we look at 2016, 73% of all votes that were counted were from white individuals, as opposed to 26.7% of people of color. Now we know in terms of the demographics of the country, that don't add up. That's some funny math if we want to go back to the Bush era. That's funny math. And so when we think about that, there is a clear, in my opinion, there's a clear impact, right? So if we look at high voter turnout, we saw a particular outcome. When we look at low voter turnout from communities of color, we saw a different turnout. And so I don't know that this is by accident. I think a lot of it is by design in some ways to effectuate certain outcomes in the election. You add on top of that, foreign officials acting on behalf of certain individuals in government. You then add this other layer on top of that as well. So can you all speak to the dangers of what happens when communities of color don't show up?
Well, I think you've already seen the dangers of what happens when communities of color don't show up. That's what we're living through right now. It's hard to tell exactly. I mean, looking at voting patterns is not an exact science. You're making a lot of speculations and generalizations based off of voting patterns. One factor that might be in there is the fact that there were some people who really did not take seriously, as you call it, the current occupant in 2016. And my frustration personally with the way that the campaign was run in 2016 with Hillary Clinton was that I felt as though there were, unfortunately, I think that she took for granted certain votes. I think she took for granted people of color coming out. And a point that Madeleine had made too about, the danger of pandering to certain communities too. More often than not, when it comes to Black and brown people, we engage in this form of identity politics. So it's like, I'm going to speak to the issues that I think are most pressing for a particular community, instead of talking about a common message or having a common thread that runs through all of our communities. And there are plenty of common threads. We want safe and affordable housing. We want economic opportunities in our communities. We want good quality schools. That transcends race and ethnicity. But that's at least a good starting point of some universality. And then you can start to have conversations about how achieving that might look different in different communities. But more often than not, whether Republican or Democrat, politicians oftentimes are pandering, and they're trying to, so when a candidate goes to let's say a rally among Latinos and starts to try to speak Spanish or do something, and you're all cringing like, ugh, or they're speaking to a group of Black folks and try to dance, ugh, and doing things that are just very inauthentic.
Carrying hot sauce in our bags, right?
Carrying hot sauce. Oh, good Lord. I mean, it's just like, listen, I just tell me, what are you going to do for the issues that our communities have raised? How are you going to approach those? And let's just have a conversation. I don't need all the other extra stuff. But that can really be a very huge turnoff to individuals, and just be like, what does that mean? And why do you need to do that? Nevertheless, I still tell people that I know we're not crazy about those choices, but not voting has unfortunately far broader consequences than voting for, I'm not going to use the expression lesser of the two evils, but voting for someone that you're not completely 100% in lockstep with, because voting is far bigger than just those two individuals. But something else that Marlene had said earlier that I think is really important to think about, and using this example, we have to really start to look at cultivating a whole new crop of candidates that are truly reflecting our values, that truly understand these issues that that our people of all ages and stages are trying to agitate and bring to the forefront, because that's how you're going to really shake up that status quo. So when we talk about we want to support new candidates, what does that mean when you say you want to support them? One of Barack's successful things that he did most successfully, as you remember from the presidential election, was the ability to mobilize small dollar donations. So individuals that say, I'm not some huge donor, I don't have $1,000 or $500 to be able to drop into a campaign, but not understanding that those $25 donations added up and they made a really huge difference. Support the individuals that you say really reflect your values, the folks who have been agitating alongside you that really have the ability to actually take that message and take those particular issues and transcend. Then we have to think about how we're supporting them and putting fresh new blood into the office. And that's instead of just trying to bolster sort of the folks who have been in there for a while. And don't get me wrong, again, because I'm in that middle age bracket, that there is something to be said about experience, and I don't want people to just completely throw experience out the gate. Because I work for the House of Representatives, I've seen older folks who are there, but they were really very good. And they're established, they know where the bodies are buried, they know how to navigate the system, they know how to deal with the rhetoric and other things. So there needs to be a balance of those. You can't just throw them all out because you lose that institutional knowledge, and you lose some of those individuals who really are very adept at navigating that system. But I think not having enough of a balance between kind of fresh and new, versus older and experienced, that's sometimes where we run into trouble. So you'll have folks who just aren't representing your interests because they are really almost a little bit more so institutionalized, so to speak. But then when you have fresh and new that don't know how to navigate that system, they're kind of flash in the pan. They're very exciting to the base, but I can tell you, because I work behind the scenes, they're not that effective internally because no one's listening to them. They don't know how to mobilize. They don't know how to get people kind of internally and their colleagues and peers. Remember, if you're at the House, there's 435 members. So I don't care how flashy you are on the outside. And, and I love AOC and other folks like that. I love that that energy. And she's very, very good. But I can also tell you a lot of the challenges that she's had when she run up right against that. Remember, I told you, this is entrenched, it's established. So you have to have a combination of both to be able to navigate that system and to really make some impact. But it does start with folks on the outside really identifying new, fresh blood and supporting those individuals from the very beginning and lifting them up so that they can get into office and to really represent those interests properly.
Marlene, I want to come to you on this same question in terms of, really just thinking about how we do it. What are the actual mechanics of it to some extent? Because I think a lot about what it means to show up to the polls and all the things that we in this society have to do to even just do that, right? I need an ID. Well, I have to be able to afford that ID. I have to be able to get to the DMV to get that ID, right? I have to then show up at a place and hope that I'm at the right location, that there isn't some other issue or problem, right? There are all these little things that I don't know that they're unintentionally designed this way to, in my opinion, suppress the vote of communities of color. So from a tactical standpoint, what do we as communities and people in communities of color need to know to be prepared on election day? What advice might you give from a tactical position to people who may be watching this?
Yeah. And I think that's a great question, because I feel like everyone's really anxious about tomorrow, but no one really is really talking about the day after tomorrow and what are we going to do, after that, because you know what I mean? Like life goes on, regardless of the situation or the outcome. And what I've been telling people is that on Wednesday, we're still going to organize. You still have to organize regardless of the outcome, right? Whether it's for making sure that we are doing something to fight back, or if it's us to make sure that we're going to hold you accountable. And how are you any different than what you said was something that wasn't doing the job right? And the thing is, I'm going to give you an example of this, because this just shows you that people do turn out. So let's pull back for a moment and look at who is the largest voting bloc in this country. And that answer to that is a non-voter. It's actually people who don't vote. And when you pay attention to a lot of the commentators and people on social media, or on mainstream media, they tend to always gravitate to certain populations that they deem is the suburban housewife in Pennsylvania. They always talk about this demographic or this population as if like you cannot lose their vote. But why is that? It's because they're prioritizing these people who are wealthy, who have the time, who are tend to be more active in the community because they have that liberty to do so. I'm not saying that other people don't, but this population, when you have a little bit more free time and you have a schedule that allows you to be more active in your community, you can do that. But they're also reason that they're prioritizing this group is because it's, in a way, they're signaling to them that you are the people that we're trying to cater to. They don't waste time trying to go into the trailer homes here in Iowa City, or where low-income housing is, or the projects, or wherever you want to call it, to then go and actually have people on the ground there to knock, to host something in community centers. This is pre-COVID, to really try to understand what is happening on the ground. To go back to Audra's point, in 2016, the biggest failure of Hillary Clinton, aside from being, not the candidate that excited most people, because she was very problematic to begin with, right? For just people on either sides of political ideology, she took a lot of things for granted. She said, I'm the Democrat, who else are you going to vote for? It's not like you're going to go for the other person. And that showed a lot of people that she honestly didn't care. And this is one of many reasons of the outcome of 2016, right? So the reason I mentioned that is because people don't understand that if you go to where the people are at, if you have a conversation with them, if you talk to them, they will come out to vote. I'm in Iowa, so I know back in February of this year, I can't believe it was February of this year, it feels like forever ago, but the Iowa caucuses were huge here during that time in trying to figure out how it will determine where people are engaging, right? So at the time, obviously, that we had a plethora of candidates. At the time, I was backing Bernie Sanders, and we've decided that we wanted to go to people that don't tend to be knocked on doors. So what we did is we went to Trailer Home Park, and this is all volunteer based. Like we knocked on people's doors. We said, hey, have you heard of this candidate? This is what he's rooting for. This is what we believe in. This is why we want to encourage him to vote. We turned out at a satellite caucus. It was a beautiful sight. We had Sudanese recent citizens who came out to participate in the caucus, and we had Latinos, and it was just a satellite caucus for people who English wasn't their primary language, and we had multiple interpreters, we had translators, we had people who prepped them before time, we had someone who organized buses to make sure that they showed up to the site, right? And I know this is back for a satellite caucus, but the reason I'm bringing this example, and there's actually a video of it, if you look up on The Intercept, a video of this, you will actually see our ground game and how we organize. And these were all people that did not vote before. But they came out because someone went to talk to them. And this is what I'm telling you. The largest voting bloc is the non-voter. A lot of both sides, Republican or Democrat, they like to stick to the voter that they know that if they go out to and if they say certain things and veiled messaging, that these people will come out to vote for them. They don't bother to put in the resources to go out to the Latino community and, like Audra says, talk about real issues, have roundtables with them, and not just try to speak Spanish or play Despacito and think, okay, I'm gonna leave now, I've been here for 40 minutes, everything's gonna be cool. You know what I mean? Like, they're gonna actually go and do the work, and it requires time. You cannot build trust in a relationship that has constantly been betrayed in 30 minutes at a rally. That doesn't work that way. You have to consistently be there. You have to show up to Flint, Michigan. You have to show up to Detroit. You have to come to other parts of Chicago that candidates don't come, because you have to show that you care. You have to say, listen, I'm coming here as a candidate because I want to see what the problem is. I need to stay grounded. And that's part of the issue. A lot of these candidates, because they tend to be too establishment, or they just think that they don't need to do the work, they're disconnected from the problem. They don't have connections or have conversations with people who are most closest to that pain of that issue, for them to really understand this is more than just my ego. This is more than just me wanting to have this title or position. This is about how can we move the country forward. I mean, look at what we're dealing with. We're literally deciding a candidate. They're both in their 70s, I believe, right? It's just, and this is not me trying to be, ageist or anything, but what I'm trying to say is that a certain generation in our country has refused to give up positions of power. And we can see this in every institution. We have these leaders who we are asking ourselves, why haven't we seen new faces? It's not that we don't want to keep the institutional knowledge. I think Audra's completely on par with that. We have to be able to pass the baton, pass down that knowledge to newer members, fresher faces, and encourage the public to say, if you support this person or you see this person that you really like, you don't have money to give them, not even $2. Can you make a couple of calls throughout the week to say your family and friends how much you think that this person can actually help and support you? I think one of the things that gives me hope is that you're starting to see a lot of people realize, I don't have to have this fancy education to run. I can run for city council. I can run for school board because I have my lived experience, because I've been living in this community. I know it more than whatever person just came here with a fancy title who wants to have this next position for their CV. You see what I'm saying? Like, you have people who are starting to realize, I can put this time and effort. I know the issues in my community and I can really bring this to light. And we're starting to see it. Our communities, no one has come to save us. We know that we have to do the ground game. A lot of us become activists because we want to, because we have no other option. Someone has to try to figure out how to pull resources in our community. Someone has to figure out, okay, who is the community hero in your community? Like right now, you can think about someone in your community that you can reach out to and say, hey, do you know where I can go for this or that? Most of us will think of a person that's not their paid title. This is something that they do on the side to really help out and organize in their communities because they have to. Not because they just want to, take on this role or do it for 6 months. Like, it's something that we have to do. We have our own existing survival strategies. And a lot of it could be translated into policy, but we keep it within our own communities because they work for our communities to try to figure out. That's a lot of the policies that came out from the Black Panthers, WAIT programs, a lot of these other things that people don't understand that came out from community organizing because someone had to do the work. A quick example, League of United Latin American Citizens was founded by veterans in Texas. And the reason that they started this organization, LULAC is the oldest and the largest Latino civil rights organization in the nation. And it started because veterans that came back from the war saw how badly they were treated, saw that the need in their community wasn't being met. And they had to create similar programs that they learned from different groups like our Black brothers and sisters who realized that they had to do the work. But at the beginning, they were the ones doing the immediate, okay, someone needs food, someone needs something for winter, this person needs help for their education, they're screwing them over. Okay, let's pull people together in the community and let's start doing things. That's how a lot of these organizations get started, and they continue to do that work because nonprofits will not get us out of this. No program or no grant will fund themselves out of these issues. Even certain community-based organizations can't take this on. But if collectively as a group, we work together to try to see what can be done and then use that as leverage to say, how is it that we're doing the work? Because we're doing the work in this pandemic, the government is not responding to us. You know what I mean? So, I can go on forever, but I think that's what we have to pay attention to. We have to pull in the people that don't vote. And that's the hardest part, because you have to have real conversations with them. You can't just try to buy them in 30 minutes.
And I know we're running out of time, and I think I just sign on wholeheartedly to everything she just said. It's so important. I just want to point out the irony here of what we're talking about. The example that Marlene gave about the engaging people who we typically don't engage, because it's true. Even and I work in election cycles, and I work in politics, and people would always say to me, "Oh, don't worry about them, don't worry about them." And I'd always ask that question, like, why don't you want to talk to the people? Well, they don't vote. It's just it's a convenient cop-out. But the person in office right now spoke to the very people who were completely and totally disengaged. You know, people who come out right now who call themselves they're Trump Republicans, meaning they don't adhere to any traditional Republican principles. These aren't fiscal conservatives. These aren't, necessarily social conservatives. They may be, but these were folks who previously had been disengaged. But they're also individuals who are fearful of our country demographics changing, fearful that they're losing out on something, fearful that they feel like there's a power shift or imbalance. And his dog whistling and that not even coded rhetoric. It started as veiled and coded, but it no longer is. It's overt. But that really pulls some of these individuals out of the shadows. But if you were to look at their voting track record, they weren't voting. They weren't coming out. They were completely disengaged. Unfortunately, he tapped into, that kind of underbelly of society. But the point is, you do see how the power of reaching out to people and engaging them in a negative way. Obviously, now what we're talking about is doing it in a more affirmative and positive way. But that if you don't believe that, engaging people who weren't otherwise engaged works, then unfortunately, you've seen your example for the last 4 years.
Wow. So I'm gonna, because we are 2 minutes over time, but I can't leave without asking this last question. So let's say, the election happens, which we know it will. No matter what, November 4th is going to be upon us. No matter who wins the election, we know that the day after will come. And for many people who vote, particularly in communities of color, that may be a great day, it may be a difficult day, depending on what way your political affiliations lean. So for individuals who may, on November 4th, feel disenfranchised, or who may feel that, see, it didn't matter, my vote didn't count. How do we keep those people engaged beyond this election cycle? What is the message that because we're going to send this out to all students. So what is the message that you would give to them, that you would say to them about the importance of remaining engaged?
Well, I would just say really quickly, I'd remind people of what Marlene talked about. You're not just voting for the top of the ticket. That's the one that gets the most attention. It's the one that's been in the news the most. I understand that, but you're voting all the way down. So quite frankly, your vote does matter. It does count. And so people have to stop thinking that because the outcome wasn't the way that I wanted it for a certain part of the ticket, and I'm not trivializing in any way, shape, or form the top of the ticket in this particular election, but it doesn't mean that your vote doesn't count, because still lower levels of government are the ones that have a more direct impact on your daily life. And so I would remind people about that. But secondly, if anything, it is important. All I would say to that is that then we didn't mobilize enough. And to Marlene's point, we didn't reach out to the folks who had been otherwise kind of disengaged from the process. We needed to do more. So for me, it's looking at what do we need to do to get more people out. Now, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic, looking at the lines and the pictures of people and folks that are coming out in the early voting totals in the city of Chicago. But there is a recognition that these times, and this is very cliched sometimes when you talk about unprecedented times, but now I think it's appropriate to use that expression, that there are people who wouldn't otherwise be coming out, who might be like, oh no, it's in the bag, that are now feeling compelled to come out. I met someone who was an Eastern European immigrant who had recently become a citizen, but he hadn't registered as yet. And he came to the early voting site because I voted yesterday. And he said, you know, what do I need to do? Can I register on site? And everyone said, yes, this is all you need. I live in Hyde Park. So he went back home to get the stuff he needed and came back in line to vote because he felt engaged and like he needed to be doing something at this moment. And this is someone who had never voted in America before. You know, so people do recognize what's at stake and they are coming out. So I'm still optimistic about that.
Marlene, to you for the last word.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that we have to keep our ancestors in mind and the people in this country who fought nail and teeth to make sure that we had an opportunity to voice our opinion. And I will tell you right now that they would not be thinking that your vote went to waste or anything like that. And times have been harder in the past, and we have continued to fight on, and that is what we will continue to do. They want you to give up. The only thing, I feel like I'm going to cite the Hunger Games because I just saw the movie yesterday, but the only thing stronger than fear is hope, and it's true. We have to have that hope, and we cannot let fear take over us and feel like we gave up and we can't do anything, because then that's when they really win. You have to keep moving one step every day.
I think with that, nothing is stronger than fear. Wait, the only thing stronger than fear is hope. I think that we close there, because I think that's a perfect way to sum up what I hope is the mantra that everyone has when they go out tomorrow and they vote. So everyone, please join me in thanking Audra Wilson and Marlene Mendoza for a phenomenal conversation. Thank you all so much for being with us and for joining us. And also, I will be remiss if I left without saying a huge thank you to both Megan Jarmuz and Pamela Thompson-Hill, who were really, truly instrumental and phenomenal in planning this entire day. So please give a round of applause to them as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Happy Election Day tomorrow, and the fight continues. So thanks so much and have a great evening.